Okay, so welcome everyone. So welcome to this event in York Festival of Ideas. Thank you for joining us in this talk or event that's called Thoughts My Own, Freedom, Captivity and the Mind. I am a cognitive psychologist at York St John University, Scott Cole. Helgi, Clayton, McClure is doing a PhD on this very subject. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about today's content. But first of all, just a bit of bits and bobs, a bit of housekeeping. So you should all be able to hear myself and Helgi. Can you give a hello?
Hello, hello.
Okay.
Try not to tread on your toes, Scott.
So you should be able to hear us now. You may be seeing subtitles or you may not, but you can alter them at the bottom of your screen, whether to see the subtitles or not. And you can also change the size of them in the settings as well. So you might want to do that. You additionally might just want to turn them off if you find them distracting. We actually can't see you and we can't hear you. That's the format of this kind of this webinar. But the way that we will know what you think and where you can give responses is just at the below on the screen, the Q&A. So if you have a look at the Q&A section, you'll be able to write things in, and that's kind of like your direct access to myself and Helgi, and we'll be able to see what you're saying, and we may respond. So obviously we might get quite a few of these responses. This will be recorded, so this will be recorded, maybe presented elsewhere. So just be aware that if you're going to write things there, some of that we might read out, and obviously we won't be giving anything identifiable like your name. Okay, and just to test, let's test that Q&A function now then. So if you're calling in from York, if you just give me a hi or some format of hello at the moment. So this is our local attendees from York. That'd be good to see. And we've already got quite a few. So it's nice to see some people locally. Yeah, lots of people who would ordinarily be in a kind of big lecture hall, probably in York St John, sitting down with a coffee at the moment. Anyone, I'm presuming there's other people from outside of York in the UK. So if you can give us a hello, that will be good. Okay, so yeah, it's good. Everyone's been able to use that. We're seeing all these messages. That's great to see. And also anyone from mainland Europe. So anyone from mainland Europe joining us today. And if you can just write down the country you're joining us from, it'd be really interesting to see all the people and where they're coming from. So if you could write down where you're coming from, if you're France, Italy. Okay, so it doesn't look like we've got anyone further afield, I don't think, than the UK. I think the most glamorous we've got is Harrogate.
That'll do for me, Scott. That'll do.
Okay, cool. Okay, so welcome everyone. And without further ado, I think I'll pass you over to Helgi, who's going to introduce today's content.
Thank you, Scott. I've just been looking through people's contributions to the Q&A, and actually I saw somebody had said hello from India. So there we go. We've made it. So yeah, globetrotting. Thank you for that. So yeah, tonight we're going to be talking about the ideas of sort of mental freedom versus mental captivity, and really the dynamics of how our brain and our mind create thoughts. So to give you a really brief overview, hopefully everyone can see the slides clearly enough there. Topics that we're going to cover tonight include, firstly, the relationship between the environment, so the surrounding world, and our thoughts, including aspects like the influence that past experience has on what we come to think about and how we think about it. This kind of thorny philosophical question of automaticity versus free will, how much control do we really have? And linked with that, the role of consciousness in determining how we think about and what we think about. Secondly, we're going to be delving a bit more into our particular sort of research niche, mine and Scott's, looking at the thoughts that we have that relate to a certain point in time in your own life. So what we call mental time travel. So more about that a little bit later. And then in the kind of final section, we'll be looking at cases where thoughts go astray slightly, and the kind of usual relationship between the environment and thoughts that we highlight at the beginning of the talk starts to become a bit strained. And so that includes cases of psychological and neurological illness, with some case studies from Scott's experience and clinical work. And then we'll try and come back round from that with a bit more of an optimistic message at the end about what we can learn about how the healthy functioning cognitive system works from those situations where it's gone a bit awry. And finally, at the end, we'd really like to get a bit of a conversation going, and maybe if any of the stuff that we talked about resonates with people, we'd like to hear from you. But of course, you've seen how the Q&A function works, and there's going to be opportunities to participate and to contribute throughout the talk as well. Topics we won't cover, not going to linger on this for too long, but just so that everybody knows the scope of what we're going to try and do. We won't be talking about unconscious thought. And I think if this was a real lecture room, some people would be going, oh, because that gets a lot of interest. But apart from anything else, as experimental psychologists, we tend to stick to the stuff that we can measure somehow or other. And we'll be explaining a bit about the methods that we use. Unfortunately, we can't really get at something if it's happening in the brain unconsciously, and the person who's having that process go on isn't even aware of it. And the content of dreams we're going to be sidestepping for today, although we have colleagues who are working on dreaming and the effects of sleep and memory and things like that, and there's a wealth of great research to look at there if you're interested. So part one then. This is all about the relationship between the environment and our thoughts, so the kind of outside-inside dichotomy. And what I'd like you to do first, try and kind of clear your mind, make sure that there's no external distractions, all of that kind of stuff. You've probably done a lot of that already. Everyone's a seasoned webinar participant by now. I'm going to show you an image on screen in a moment, and you'll be able to look at it for half a minute or so. And I'd like you just to type in the Q&A what it brings to mind. And if possible, just try and be as uninhibited as you can. Just give us your first reaction to this image. Okay, so here goes. So is that bringing anything up for anyone? Got a couple of responses trickling in. Great, excellent. So, yeah, I can see Scott smiling there as well. I think we're both reading the same list of things. It's very devious, this mechanism, because we can look through what everybody's put before we kind of choose what to reveal and what to come back on. So I'll give you another few seconds. A few more people are coming in with something. Haha, excellent. So somebody who happens to be a relative of mine has hit the jackpot and has said they can see the Taj Mahal. Anybody else seeing that now that I say that? That was one of the things I came up with as a possible answer to this. So you're definitely on the same wavelength there. But we've had such a diversity of answers that I'm only going to be able to read a few of them out. Interestingly, there's a bit of a theme of bulls in there. The bulls' heads with horns. But then again, someone else has said 2 dead birds. So what we're getting from this then is I've simply shown you an image on screen, right? And everybody, wherever you are within Yorkshire or elsewhere in the world, has seen exactly the same thing. You're receiving the same visual stimulation to the brain, and yet people's kind of subjective responses to that vary widely between the Taj Mahal and 2 angry bulls and a dead bird. Some people have come up with something even more abstract, like dark forces. Dark forces attacking a monk-like figure. That's great. It's very creative. So what we're trying to say with this is, what's happening there if everybody's making such different responses? And the way that we would look at this from a cognitive perspective is that that's an objectively meaningless stimulus. So it's just a kind of symmetrical pattern made by some ink spreading out on either side of the page. But everybody's brain, when faced with that image, is working proactively to create meaning, causing some to see, quite dark and gothic things, and other people to maybe see, mystical landscapes or any of the other things you've mentioned, or the Taj Mahal. But in any case, what you've seen there, and the way you've interpreted that ambiguous kind of meaningless image, is going to be heavily shaped by past experience. However, sorry to disappoint, it's unlikely to reflect any deep secrets. And I'm quite pleased to say that I've not seen anything there that's really kind of thrown me off. So excellent work so far. We're going to carry on in that vein. So I'll be showing you a few more images and seeing what you come up with. So for the next one, I'm going to give you slightly less time. So quick off the bat, if you can. What do you see here in this image? Brilliant. So we've had maybe 20 responses already. And straight off the bat, people have been saying hand washing, washing your hands. Within about 3 or 4 responses, someone says virus. And that's all they've put. So I was wondering if people's minds would go there. I wonder if, had I shown you the same image 18 months ago, would anyone have mentioned viruses or contagion? Maybe not. But in any case, people's responses are still quite varied. So even though this is a highly meaningful stimulus, isn't it? We all know what a sink looks like with a tap. We could describe it in some technical detail. It's a mixer tap. Somebody has picked up, although this didn't come in for a dozen or so responses, somebody's picked up on the pink manicured fingernails and have said, I think it's a woman washing their hands. So that's interesting as well, that nobody else, that wasn't salient to anybody until that point. But I was hoping we get something related to COVID, because that reflects not only these kind of individual different tendencies to read into an image, but also contextual, and what we might call a kind of historical effect, where we've been in the middle of this pandemic for a certain amount of time. Images of hand washing have a certain strong association almost for everyone that cuts across any of those individual variations and what it might make you think of. Okay, so the last one in this series, look at this one very carefully and give us your tuppence worth. Brilliant. So people are straight on the money here. Maybe because I pulled out that Taj Mahal example. People know that I want them to be specific, but also I think this is a testament to the Yorkshire-centric audience. That we've had about 4 people come straight in with Malham. It's Malham Cove. That's what it is. So in a way, you've outsmarted me there. But we do have some people who've said something on a slightly different level of description. So wonderful holidays in the Dales. Not quite as specific as Malham. Maybe they do recognize it, but maybe the first thing it made them think of was more of a past experience relating to that, which is great because we'll pick up on that in part 2. So really what I wanted to emphasize here is this individually determined thought content that we get from an image. If I showed this to people outside of the Yorkshire context, probably no one would know exactly where it was, and people would almost have to resort to describing it in more general terms. So there's a rock face, I can see a stream, etc. And so this gives us a way in to looking at a bit of psychological theory on how the kind of content of thought comes to be so individualized. So Larry Barsalou, who's an American researcher who's been quite prolific, done a lot of kind of squirreling away in his own study and writing these massive sole-authored papers that are quite rare. Often in the psychological literature, lots of people are collaborating in a team to kind of write papers and come up with theories. But he has this very wide-ranging theory of situated conceptualization, which explains how highly individual responses come to occur for quite generic stimuli. So, for example, showing someone a picture of a sink resulting in such a range of responses as we had there. Essentially, it's not the same sink for you as it is for me, is what we're saying. So we can't explain our cognitive responses to things just by what's subjectively there in the image or in the word or whatever else it may be, because every historical encounter that we've had with a certain type of stimulus, so for example with a sink or with a rock face like the one at Malham Cove, is going to have shaped our kind of internal concepts that relate to that in an ongoing way. So it's not as simple as, we go through childhood and we learn what a sink is, etc., and then that's there and that's static. I think the COVID-related responses are testament to that fact that even the learning that we've kind of done as adults in the last year or 18 months or so has quite heavily influenced what we do with seeing that tap. That might not continue to be the case if, as we're hoping, vaccination efforts are very successful and we move away from thinking about COVID and thinking of hand washing in that way. But in any case, these kinds of concepts and these very individualized concepts based on experience are key to when we kind of cut loose a little bit and simulate or imagine things completely from scratch. And again, we're going to talk about that a bit more in part 2. So hopefully we've kind of laid the foundation there a little bit. I can probably skip through this. This is 2 observers looking at the image of Malham Cove. Somebody's coming up with a cognitive response, a sequence of thoughts that are probably very influenced by certain emotional associations, so fear of heights. Somebody else looking at the same thing, just like in the diverse audience that we've got here tonight, will say, that's Malham Cove, I recognize that straight off, and that leads you without even trying onto telling this anecdote about something that happened to you in that location. So onto the $1 million question then, freedom or captivity. What does the stuff that we've gone through so far tell us about this? Well, we've acknowledged that our thoughts are heavily shaped by ongoing experience, such that you guys all immediately had associations and had stuff kind of crowding into your awareness as soon as I showed you some of those images. And that may even have been fairly involuntary. I suppose you have to make the choice to be looking at the screen, but beyond that, once you see the sink, you can't really help but bring those other concepts to mind, so COVID or whatever it may be. So there's a series of experiments in the 80s that have been quite influential, known as the White Bear series of studies, where Daniel Vega and colleagues got different groups of people they set people up to expect a period of time where their thoughts were going to be monitored and they could think about whatever they liked, and they just had to sort of report it as faithfully as possible. And one group of people were told, you can think of anything apart from a white bear, don't think of a white bear. And then using a clever technique designed to allow them to capture thoughts without making people too aware of it, they found that telling people not to think of the white bear made people think about it a lot more than if they just mentioned a white bear as an example of something you might think of, but didn't say, don't go there. So in other words, what we call ironic processing. The brain and the cognitive system are so sensitive to these kind of cues, it's almost doing the opposite of what you've told it. Okay, I've been told not to think of a white bear. Oh, there I go again, the white bear. So in this, given these 2 kind of propositions or statements, could we maybe argue that mental freedom, at least in this kind of context, is quite limited because we're very led by what's in front of us? Well, not so fast, because even if we look at 19th century, the work of the 19th century utilitarian philosopher J.S. Mill, who was very into the idea of freedom in both a political and a kind of philosophical sense, the fact that we have these idiosyncratic individual responses and two of us can look at the same picture and see something completely different is in itself kind of a proof that we do enjoy some kind of freedom. So even if our thoughts are guided by the external world, the very fact that they're unique and personal responses means that we are to some extent free. So more recently then, this idea has been developed and people have had some kind of radical ideas on the other side of the argument. So I think I'll hand over to Scott at this point, and he can tell you a little bit about the concept of automaticity.
Yeah, so so in the 1940s, the 1950s, it was a really popular idea in psychology, which has kind of came back in some form in the 90s actually, around behaviorism. So this might be familiar to lots of you. You might have heard of Pavlov's dogs, and this idea that he had some dogs and he associated, the ringing of the bell with some food, and he did that over several trials. And then eventually, when he rung the bell, lo and behold, the dogs started creating saliva. They got hungry. They indicated they were hungry, and they expected food, indicating that we are sort of influenced by our environment, by what's the associations, the stimuli around us. And B.F. Skinner here was a huge advocate of that kind of viewpoint, which was that a lot of our thoughts, they're not that important. We might have different thoughts in the day. What's really important, based on that name, behaviorism, what's really important is how you behave. And how you behave is kind of, we're not often aware, and we're kind of, we respond to different stimuli based on reward a lot of the time and based on what we expect. But a lot of the time, we're not even aware of how our behavior is being affected. And I'll give you an example of this. So this is when I was studying behaviorism. A lecturer told us this story. I still don't know if it was true, but it's quite compelling. And his story, they were learning, obviously they were getting engaged in this idea of behaviorism, the fact that it could change behavior really subtly. And what they did is every time the lecturer came into the lecture hall, they wouldn't pay him much attention. So when he was on the podium, they would kind of avert their gaze, look to the side, and they wouldn't really look at him, paying much attention. So that's not very good if you're a lecturer. We would get a bit distressed about that. But then what happened is when he moved away from his podium, they started looking at him and they started being engaged. They might even, ask him questions, and they look up and things like that. They did this over a series of weeks, and after about 10 weeks, lo and behold, he was standing right next to the wall, doing his lecture right next to basically in the corner of the room. Again, I'm sure this story has been exaggerated a lot, but it makes the point that we can be, our behavior is changed by our environment, by the kind of reward systems that are put in place around us. And also we're not aware of these things. So hence the word automata or puppets. We are merely kind of puppets to the stimulus that's going on around us. So if we move forward from that idea in the 50s, in the 60s of this behaviorism idea, we move forward to the 1990s. There was a series of experiments by John Bargh. And this is really important because it really changed the views, again, of psychology, went back to this idea of automatic behaviors. So one of his experiments, so I think this is the chameleon effect, it's called. So in this study, participants were given, as part of like a range of tasks, they were asked to read words associated with older adults. Okay, so it might be things like bungalow and things like that. They were asked to read a series of words like this in one group, and in another group they were just asked to read some neutral words that are not related to older people. And they found that when they serendipity, unaware, they were kind of recording these people when they walked out the lab, and they found that the people walked significantly slower when they had read them words about older people. They weren't aware that they were walking slower because of that, which is the key point. And in another study, which you may have heard of, a very famous study now, is when they asked participants to pose as interviewers, they judged people much more positively when they were holding a hot drink than when they were holding a cold drink. So their physical perceptions was affecting their kind of subjective perceptions of other people, which is, when you think about that and interviewing someone, that's a huge effect. And they found a really kind of this was really surprising in psychology. This is really important. Again, this is really important also because this research has not been replicated recently. So there have been a couple of failed attempts to replicate this kind of research, and John Barge has come under some criticism for this. And so we come again to this view of, is behaviorism really the answer? And are we really just kind of puppets going by stimuli?
Brilliant. Thank you, Scott. So I feel like you got a lot of background there, which is really nice in terms of the history of psychology angle. And what we're going to do now is we're going to switch back to participation mode. And what I'm going to do is eliminate outside influences altogether and see where your minds go then. Okay, so again, fingers on buzzers in that Q&A box. And how do you respond to this?
Helgi?
Mm-hmm.
If you move the slide on, I think it's stuck.
Ah,
there we go.
is that better?
Yep. So no stimulation, guys. Let's see what you think of now. So this is the classic thing of just, you've got nothing. What do you think about? And we're hoping that nothing is not the answer to that question. Although for some people it is. Some people have said that, nothingness, kind of void, things like that. But we've got things like feelings. It's evokes feelings, hasn't it, Helgi? Like peace. We've got someone saying that they're maybe imagining they're in a tube train underground. Things have gone dark.
I really like this one, Scott. What's coming next?
Okay.
There we go. So some people are almost going, right, I'm not seeing anything, so I need to be prepared for anything, maybe. I don't know. Somebody's repeatedly mentioning the white bear. Again, a member of my family. It's, I like the fact that some of you have revealed who you are, and you know who you are. Some of you just revealed who you are implicitly by other means. Yeah, interesting. So some people are saying things that are quite influenced by emerging understanding of what it is to be in this sort of virtual communication environment. So technological failure. And yeah, apologies for the slide freeze. I was sitting there thinking, it's a black screen. I'm just going to sit back and rub my hands. And other people's responses are very influenced by their current physiological state. So we're saying people who are saying, seeing people saying, I'm thinking of food. And that's our bad for having a webinar at dinner time. I did think maybe people would combine it with food and maybe be eating some tapas at the same time or something. But that's great. So really, again, to kind of wrap up from that and give some explanation. What we wanted to do is prompt you to try and take a sample of your thoughts in the absence of any environmental input. So of course, there was some context and everything, but just looking at the screen, it was black, there was no sound, etc. And make this point that actually you're still thinking of all kinds of different things, whether it be the white bear, whether it be sort of looking forward to what's going to happen next, or bad associations of the dark or anything. And so, to pardon a corny pun, thought continues under its own steam. There we go. You don't necessarily need that kind of pull power of environmental stimuli or outside influences, even though the evidence that Scott just discussed then very much seems to suggest that that has a strong effect on us and is almost keeping us captive and dependent on being cued by our environment. What I like about the steam train analogy is that it would have worked just as much for John Stuart Mill in the 1850s, and just as much for the very earliest experimental psychologists in Germany in the kind of 1870s and 1880s, who were grappling with this kind of thing and first using the phrase psychology lab. So, what can consciousness tell us then? Consciousness, as any of you will know who have it, which hopefully is most of us, or have perhaps studied it in one context or another, is a notoriously slippery concept. Some have argued it's simply experience itself. It's the ineffable quality of human experience as opposed to just stuff happening outside of human subjectivity. While that may be all well and good philosophically, that's difficult for us to use, again, as experimentalists who are trying to kind of pin down behaviors. And so we would define it probably something along these lines: so the ability to disengage from your surroundings and focus on internal states, which is probably what a lot of you did when faced with that blank slide. You kind of went, oh, well, they're asking me for a response, they're not giving me anything, I'm going to kind of turn within and see what's going on under the surface. And then related to this, one of the famous pioneers of positive psychology, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I believe it's a Hungarian name, and his wife, Isabella, came up with this really nice analogy in the 80s of consciousness is a clutch. So we've talked about this extreme automatist kind of view. We're just automata or puppets who are being kind of driven along by what's in front of us, and what's going on in our head is not very much in our control. And then on the other hand, the kind of common sense idea, no, hang on, I do have the freedom to choose what I'm paying attention to, and I do have this great individuality coming from different past experiences, and I can actually switch off the outside almost, and kind of keep myself entertained with daydreams and with thoughts that come from within. So consciousness is then the clutch that allows us to switch between those two sort of modes. So in part one, we've been through the influences of the environment on thought and how that specifically relates to repeated past experiences with certain types of things, whether it's sinks or rocky walks in Yorkshire. We've also looked at this idea of autonomy, so freedom versus automaticity, and maybe being more captive or at the mercy of our environment. And this just summarizes a few of those kind of historic views that we've compared there. And finally, consciousness, although it's difficult to define and definitions can be controversial, if we define it in a certain way as this ability to disengage and sort of switch gears between internal and external, then it can start to kind of fill this explanatory gap and explain the relationship between when we're getting very pulled by our environment and when we're sort of doing our own thing mentally. So for this next bit, I'm going to hand back over to Scott, and he's going to tell you about mental time travel, which is at the heart of the research that we both do at York St John.
Okay, so at this point in time, you may have had a few of your own kind of thoughts triggered by what we've said so far. So if you, it'd be good for us if you do have those thoughts and questions, write them down. And we've got some time at the end. We've allowed about 20 minutes at the end, where we're going to kind of go through questions and stuff. So if you've got any questions, yeah, just make a note of them, and you can put them on the Q&A when we get to the end, so we can kind of go through everyone's questions one by one. A lot of this stuff does make you think quite a lot, and we're probably covering quite a lot of stuff in a broad way, so you know, you might link to a lot of things. So let's have a think about this idea then. So when we're thinking about the kinds of things that go through our head in a daily basis, we know as psychologists that some of that stuff is going to be about memories. Some of that stuff is going to be things from our past that are just coming back, and we know sometimes that can go wrong in PTSD, but we know that in everyday life we get a lot of those memories coming back to us. And as psychologists, this is the way this is kind of the framework here on this slide. We think about memory, or memory about ourselves, in terms of broad subjects, like broad topics like lifetime periods, like childhood, like being in high school, and we can also go down to a more specific event. So you can think of your own childhood and you say, what was your childhood like? Oh, well, it was like this. I went to this school for 5 years. I went to this school for 8 years or something. But we can also ask about general events. So a general event is something that might repeat and is quite a standard kind of event that you might do on the weekend. So playing with grandma might be one that you had as a child. And even more specific, you can pick out kind of events. So you might have knocked over some drink over the floor and created a big mess on the floor with like Coca-Cola on the new white carpet, and you remember that as a specific event. So you've got this kind of different ways of remembering, and this has been around in psychology for a good 30 years now, this idea, and this is quite recognized, and this is the way that we do experiments based on the assumption that this is how memory works, that we've got different levels of kind of detail we can go into. If you just go back, Helgi, just a second, and then what we do is we have this idea about the future as well, and the way that psychologists think about the future in terms of how humans generally imagine it is it's not wild fantasies, it's not things that are not plausible, like people flying in the air. When you ask people to imagine the future, they generally fall into these kind of quite anodyne, quite practical things about what they're going to do next week, next month, or next year. And so here we've got the example of maybe thinking forward to like your working life, maybe parenthood, and then doing the school run. And then maybe you might think of a specific event in the school run that might happen. So like you're hearing your child's first word or something like that. So something like that. So yeah. So and then what we've got is this idea that we construct the past and we construct the future. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So what we do is we psychologists have kind of described this remembering and imagining as constructing. So it's the idea that if you give people, this is the general way that researchers do it, they'll give people like cues. So they give people like a word. So for example, it could be shoes, and then they say, okay, what can you think of a memory related to that word in the last year? And someone might say, last week I brought my sister some shoes for her birthday. What we also find is that happens in the future as well. So we can easily elicit some future thoughts from people. And as I say, they tend to be quite plausible. They tend to be quite around plans and events. So next week I'll drive to the coast with my friend and we will swim in the sea. So we're able to do this, and the kind of neuroanatomy, some of you would notice this part of our neuroanatomy on the screen. This is, of course, the human cortex, so the human brain here, illustrated here on the left. And you might see there's a structure that's kind of highlighted right in the middle of the brain, quite protected, and protected for a reason, because it's very, very important. So right at the bottom end of that loop, you find what we call two hippocampi. So a hippocampus on the left and right, and we all have these in our brains, and this allows us to perform these skills. So you'll see a brain scan on the right hand side, and what that illustrates is a kind of breakthrough finding So this was a really big finding in, I think it was 2007, and Donna Rose Addis published this research that really kind of influenced hundreds of scientific papers. So she basically found that when people remember specific events in the past and imagine specific events in the future, it reliably activates the same region of the brain every single time. It's activating the same structures that I mentioned before. And what was also more powerful in terms of the results, if you want to click on, there was a study by Demis Hassabis and colleagues. And what they did is they identified 5 patients who had quite substantial damage to the hippocampi, so usually to both of those, left and right. And they found a substantial reduction. You'll see on the left-hand side of that figure, of that bar chart, it's about half the amount of detail that people were able to produce when they had that damage. And the damage was due to various reasons, like encephalitis, kind of like an infection of the brain, and various things like that. So this was a huge kind of finding. As a little bit of a side fact, anyone that you're interested, Demis Hassabis is actually leading DeepMind, the AI part of Google at the moment. So we kind of lost him from this area of research, and he went on to lead this huge area you may have heard of, that Google is funding with millions and millions of pounds, obviously. So well, let's come back to the more important thing, is that this ability to construct, so when this ability to construct memories or reconstruct memories and construct imagined future events is quite common in daily life. That's generally what we find, and they often have a kind of social purpose. So we often share it with colleagues, we often share these with family. So what I would like you to do is in the Q&A, I'll give you about a minute, is just to respond with either past, future, or both, as to whether you've either shared a memory in the last week, shared a future event in the last week, or both. So if you could just do that, it would give us a sense of how common that is.
So just for the record, most people are saying both. Some people in block capitals, some people with an exclamation mark, for just really emphasize that. It's quite a simple data collection method, isn't it, Scott? We're not asking for frequency or anything else. But I will say for the record that the first person to chip in before you'd finished speaking said future.
Okay.
So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, we won't publish this research. Yeah, but yeah, it's really good, and I guess it does tell a story. And if you want to go to the next slide, the story is that that actually what we've been doing in the research, and there's been lots of studies on this, and the research I just showed you, is we sit people in a lab and we ask them directly, to come up with these events. Okay, so it's very directive. We as researchers are telling people what to do, and they're doing it. And you can imagine that this is not a typical thing in daily life. We don't get asked to produce this unless we're going to see a psychologist or something like that, or a psychoanalyst, maybe thinking about the past. And one of the things we did in a recent study is with a colleague, Leah Kavavalashvili in Hertfordshire University, is we found that actually, yeah, this was a dominant thing. People were asking people, and instead, what we found is that some studies actually monitored what happened in everyday life. So we found that there are these studies that give people a little a monitor, kind of a little a click monitor, so they could monitor over 1 week how many memories do they have popping into their heads, how many future events do they have popping into their heads. And what they found is this kind of this concept that came up, which is called involuntary mental time travel. So this was established by a Danish researcher in 2008, and she and her colleagues found that around 45 times a day, we actually have these thoughts that arise in our minds when we're doing things. For example, when you're doing washing up, when you're driving, when you're cycling, when you're just walking along, looking at the trees. What they found is that a lot of the time we're getting this idea of mental time travel, that your mind is kind of going into the future or the past. That actually happens without anyone asking you. So what we think is that that's actually quite an important distinction. We think that that is an important aspect of psychology, in that they just appear. We're more interested in that because it tells us something about the general thoughts we have. So we were very interested in this. So then what we did is we brought that idea back to the lab to try and find out how they occur in the human mind. Over to you, Helgi.
Thank you. So I'm going to just talk you through the procedure that Scott and I have been using sort of the past few years. I've been doing my PhD study since 2018, and Scott's published a few papers using this kind of method before that point. And so this is attempting to get a handle on those kind of spontaneous instances of mental time travel to the past and future in as subtle a way as possible, but also in the same way across a large group of people. So for my first study doing this kind of thing, we got 78 people through the lab, and we wanted to try and keep as much constant as possible, given what we already know about just how variable things are and how people's minds can go off in all sorts of different directions. So I've given you a couple of seconds for this to kind of sink in the background, but I'll now explain. On the left, we have what we call the primary task, which is in this case a vigilance task, and that all that means is that we're asking people to look out for something. And so in a very long stream of slides, one coming up after the other on a computer screen, most of them have a range of horizontal lines, as you see depicted here on most of the slides. And then there's the occasional target slide, which has vertical instead, outlined there in red. And what we're asking people to do, first of all, is to really sustain attention on what those lines are doing. And whenever they see vertical, hit the spacebar as quickly and accurately as possible. And so that is very much in line with standard kind of cognitive psychology paradigms that might be looking at people's attention, how quickly people are able to discriminate between two different things, and so on. But of course, as psychologists have thought, what we're really interested in is what else is happening. And we know that because they only have to press this button maybe 10 times in half an hour sitting in the lab, it can be quite slow and monotonous. And typically people's minds begin to wander. And so we also give them the opportunity to report thoughts. And there's two different ways you can do this, but for simplicity, I'll stick to what we call the self-caught method, where people can choose whenever they notice their mind wandering and them almost pressing down that clutch of consciousness and veering into internally generated thoughts and images, they can choose to fill in a form in order to give us some information about that. And this allows us to look at how many times that happens, what types of thoughts, whether they're past or future, or atemporal thoughts that don't link to that personal timeline. And it also enables us to ask certain questions. And in this version of the task, you'll notice there's also a phrase there, warm weather, kind of staring you in the face. You might be thinking, what's that about then? So this is an example of a cue, much like the examples that Scott used, shoes. Think of something to come up relating to shoes that's either a week ago or a week in the future. Except this time, people are being told, no, just look at the lines, just click the button when you see the vertical lines. And so they're what we call incidental cues. They're just kind of wallpaper, but we know that they're going to have an influence in the way that we demonstrate it to ourselves, with me putting certain images on screen and your mind immediately going somewhere. So we say, ignore the phrases on screen, but then in the thought reports, each time somebody chooses to report a thought, we ask them if there was anything that triggered it. And pretty consistently, 6 or 7 times out of 10, people will say it was one of the phrases, and they'll even write down exactly what it was. Because often these thoughts will be triggered in a matter of kind of 1 to 4 seconds or something after the phrase has come on screen. And so it'll be very fresh in people's minds, and they write that straight down. We can also ask them to gauge things like the subjective level of effort involved. And this is quite important because, as you can imagine, people could still see warm weather and they could go, oh, that's a nice phrase. I'm now going to dream up a holiday scenario next year. And that would be very much the voluntary mode of future thinking we saw earlier, which involves deliberate, almost searching through a sort of mental database. And that's not what we want when we're looking at involuntary, spontaneous ones. And so we check. And again, in this kind of task context, 9 times out of 10, people rate this as being kind of a 1 or a 2 on that effort scale. Sometimes we use 1 to 7. There's a lot of dry technical detail behind that, but the majority of the time it's going to be below that middle point, indicating that people didn't really mean to construct the event that they might have imagined around the phrase warm weather. It just happened. So this helps us to answer the question of how these thoughts arise, because we see different dynamics in there. Like I say, 60 or 70% are cued by the triggers, 30% aren't. Are those 2 different mechanisms of thought that are going on? You can also change the cues, since we know that they have such a pull on the content of people's thoughts and the number of times they choose to report. And we actually find that if you make them very frequent, so like on every slide in that diagram I just showed you, then that starts to suppress thinking. So maybe a bit like that ironic processing effect. Don't think of the white bear immediately you do. It's kind of like, here's loads of opportunities to have thoughts, and you become overloaded. And the verbal cues, interestingly, despite the common aphorism that a picture speaks 1,000 words, actually 2 words seem to do the job of a lot of different imagery and pictures when it comes to spontaneous thought. And giving somebody a cue simple as warm weather can cause their mind to spiral in all sorts of directions when they're otherwise only engaged in quite a boring, repetitive task. So what happens then when the cue content is changed? And this is kind of at the heart of one of my PhD studies that I've been working on for a couple of years now, and we've recently adapted it so that it can run completely online, because as you can imagine, there's been lots of difficulties with being able to invite people into a physical lab room safely and so on. So what I did in this study starting in kind of November 2018, I wanted to establish what people were doing with the cues and whether that would change if I changed the information in them. So basically what words were being presented. So the standard kind of cue phrases that have been used before by people like Leah Kvavalashvili, whose wonderful name we had on a previous slide, are generally quite generic and standard. The idea is that they're phrases that a lot of people can relate to. They actually came from studies, like Scott mentioned, diary studies of what it was that had caused people to have memories come back up in daily life. So there might be things like warm weather, as we saw, or Christmas tree. And these are actual genuine example data from my experiment. Somebody saw the phrase warm weather and within a couple of seconds pressed the button to pause the task and recorded the thought walking the dog in the sun, rated it on a number of characteristics, as I explained. And so far, so predictable, right? You know, people are seeing warm weather, they're having thoughts that relate thematically or kind of meaningfully to those phrases in a way that we can all immediately kind of identify. And the same with Christmas tree there. But sometimes this isn't the case. And one of the conditions that I used, one of my groups of sort of 20 people conducting the experiment, instead of seeing these generic phrases, the task was interspersed with the same phrases, but with the order of the characters randomly scrambled or jumbled. So that included things like this. And the first example there of the bottom pair, as the eagle-eyed among you may notice, originated as the phrase puffy eyes. And so in this standard condition, had somebody seen puffy eyes, we might expect them to come up with a thought regarding something being wrong with their eyes, or maybe hay fever, especially if they were taking part in the study right about now, this time of year. And so what we see is that even if we scramble those letters, and bear in mind people have been told don't look at these are irrelevant to what you're doing, people will manipulate that scrambled cue to the extent of being able to read it after all, getting some meaning out of it, and then having that thought relating to a problem with their sight, much as they might have done in typical conditions with a sort of standard cue. And the one that I've really highlighted at the bottom was one that caused me to have to do a bit of detective work to try and work out the relationship between the cue and the thought in the first place, because this originated, as you might be able to tell, as the phrase treasured possession. And bearing in mind this is only flashed up for a second or so, and they're only occasional, you've been told to ignore them, so a lot of people wouldn't register that they'd seen a phrase that was like treasured possession. But this person has actually had a thought about a lab report that was coming up, And they said, yes, it was triggered by one of the cues. And they've said, I wasn't sure what the cue said. It was a few seconds ago now, but I think I read the word stressed. And so we're seeing a really nice example of people proactively seeking meaning in those environmental cues. I've checked thoroughly the cues for a minute or so either side of this point in that person's data record, and there's no mention of stress or being stressed. I don't think there is at all in the set of cues, even if you were to reorder them so they were correctly spelled and interpretable. So we're seeing somebody, there's a nonsense phrase, it's hard to get much out of it, and the person has actually done something themselves with some of the constituent letters of that phrase, and that's brought to mind the concept of stress, and then they've related that to what's going on in their lives at the minute. And so this gives us a really nice way in to looking at how it is, finally, that our thoughts are kind of triggered by the environment. And so we can talk in this context about the dynamic interplay of the person and the environment. So if you imagine encountering a sunflower image like this, I won't ask you to post in the Q&A, but I imagine you'll all have responded in some way to that already. For a given person, they might see that image and think, that reminds me of my childhood home in California, surrounded by sunflowers. Somebody else seeing exactly the same image in the same conditions, maybe that lab context like I showed you, might think, oh, I've got to remember to water the plants because it's been dry weather, it's been a dry spell. And so qualitatively, thematically, totally different types of content there. This person's revisiting a memory, like we saw in the theory of mental time travel. This person is thinking about a future event, and more importantly, thinking about something in relation to a plan or an intention that they want to remember to follow through with. And when you think about remembering to do something, we call that in cognitive psychology prospective memory. So remembering stuff in the future, essentially, rather than remembering facts or information or events from the past. And so, as I've hinted at earlier on in the webinar, this kind of model of the interaction between the two suggests that the spontaneous thoughts we have are not just determined by what's going on outside, not just determined by what's going on inside and what's actually important to us, but they're determined sort of jointly by a dynamic interaction of that personal stuff. And that includes whether you're hungry or tired right now, by the way, as well, the interaction of that with the environment. So back over to Scott to interpret this lovely visual for you.
So some of the research that I've done, so this is from a study that I did in Denmark when I was doing some research there. What you're looking at now is basically all the past and future events that we elicited from people when they did this task that Helgi's talking about, and we kind of sampled their thoughts. We tried to see if they were thinking of the past, the future, and we plotted how far into the future those thoughts were, and we did the same thing for the past. This hadn't really been looked at before, and we're interested in kind of if these things coming to mind quickly, are they about distant events or are they about really close events? And as you can probably see, so the black line, the solid line, is an involuntary thought, and the dotted line is a voluntary thought. You see that the future thoughts and the past thoughts are kind of mirroring each other. They're kind of it's a nice kind of it kind of shows the same thing I was talking about before, that they're quite similar in processes, but it shows also that the vast majority of our future thoughts are about things we're going to do very soon, usually within the next weeks and months. And we think that is because they are largely goal related. In contrast to what the behaviorists thought, actually some of our thoughts are inextricably related to our goals. And we found that, the majority of even the involuntary future thoughts were about what we call uncompleted goals. And I think this would be a good time to move on to the next slide. Helgi?
No problem. I'm just typing an answer to a question we've had about triggering. So that should have been sent now.
So this links us really nicely to what's called the Zeigarnik effect. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Zeigarnik effect. It was an amazing researcher, 1927, Bloomer Zygarnik, came up with this idea that, and she carried out experiments to prove it, is that when we've got something that is an unfinished task, okay, something like a project, something we're working on, we're much more likely to have that come to mind quickly. We're much more likely to be reminded of that than completed tasks. And if you move on to the next bit, sorry, Helgi, I know you're busy. You're doing dual tasking as our participants do, and
not my forte, I'm afraid. Did my best.
So what we see is that even in 2018, this idea is still very, very vibrant, and actually is becoming more and more popular in psychology. So this idea that a person's goal is a good predictor of what cues in the environment are picked up on and reacted against. And this is a really quite a simple idea, I guess, but it's the idea that our inner goals and our plans for the future are actually sensitizing us to the environment. So the adverts on TV, posters, we're sensitized to those that are thematically linked to our goals, because that makes sense, right? We want to pay attention to things that are going to help us achieve our goals. So we think this is an extremely functional thing, and a reason why we should pay attention to those thoughts.
So we're going to sidle swiftly through the next demonstration, because that's all going to look crazy with that explanation. But I don't want to leave the slides completely. Let's summarize what we've covered in part 2. So we've talked about how past and future events are constructed in relation to the self, using elements from memory in both cases. And we've said that a kind of paradigm shift that's happened in the past 10 years or so is that these actually occur all the time in everyday life. And maybe we can use this kind of involuntary thought sampling technique that we've explained to you to bring that back into the lab and look at it under controlled conditions without getting people to artificially come up with scenarios. And the involuntary mental time travel arises through this constantly shifting kind of interaction of person and their kind of hopes and fears, goals essentially, and the context that they're in. So the final part of the talk is going to be considering what happens when things go awry. As I've said, when the anchor works loose, kind of connects us with our immediate environment. And to understand this, we're going to look a little bit at what happens in a kind of generic situation where somebody is highly anxious, right? So a situation of anxiety. If we're not highly anxious, let's say to begin with, and we're faced with something that's clearly a threat type stimulus, so for example, an unambiguous angry face, and that's been documented by Ekman and other researchers as being something that's universal. So we could see somebody from Polynesian Islands do an angry face, and somebody from Seattle do an angry face, and we'd be able to identify it regardless of our kind of cultural context. And if we're kind of in an emotionally balanced, kind of a calm state, for want of a better word, and kind of the cognitive system is doing its job smoothly, we should be able to register that potentially threatening stimulus and have a kind of helpful response that allows us to deal with that in a way that doesn't blow it out of proportion. So I think that person's overreacting to something, I'm just going to give them a wide berth. I'm going to tread carefully. However, when somebody is highly anxious, the same stimulus suddenly is effectively amplified and given much greater salience and has much more of an influence on their thoughts and on their physiology and what's going on emotionally. And so suddenly that same angry face can make somebody different in an anxious state think, help, what are they doing to me? What have I done? This is a serious threat to me that I need to address immediately. And that can then really start to dominate. And so what Scott's going to tell you about now is his work in population of people with OCD and suffering from OCD type symptoms. And this is a situation where people are very particularly attuned to certain threat cues.
Okay, so just to give you a quick definition of what OCD is, I know there's a lot of things in the media where people say, you know, someone's a bit OCD. Actually, it's a very serious and debilitating condition consisting of obsessions around specific concerns and compulsions to remedy the concern and reduce somebody's extreme anxiety. So I'll give you an example of that. So let's to make things concrete. So imagine there's a person called John, and John has particular concerns and anxieties about leaving on the gas, and he will check the gas maybe 10 times before he leaves. He's still quite anxious. He leaves his house, locks the door, walks away, and suddenly he's got these intrusive thoughts. Suddenly he's kind of plagued by these repetitive, spontaneous thoughts. If you want to put onto the next slide. Yeah. So and what happens here is that, you know, the more these thoughts come to mind, they're kind of going in a it's kind of a feedback loop whereby people have these thoughts, and they get more and more concerned. You know, these could be about the past, so it could be an image of the gas being left on, you know, and that's being left on, and maybe I made a mistake, maybe I made a mistake, and that's repeating, or maybe a future really dramatic scenario like that house is going to burn down. If I go to work, the house is 100% going to burn down. And all these intrusive images contribute to this feeling of anxiety. And John, therefore, follows the cycle of OCD. So he will go back and check again. And this is how it continues. So here we have an example of where spontaneous thoughts have gone wrong. They're not doing this positive job. They're actually maintaining poor mental health in an anxiety disorder.
And next, we're going to talk more about the brain-based side of things. Then, right? So neurological conditions which can also impact past and future thinking. And so, the case of amnesia.
So we've kind of got an understanding of these two brain areas. These called the hippocampi on the left and right, and when we have people who have got very dramatic memory problems, they're called amnesics, and the amnesics can't remember things from 1 minute to the next. They won't be able to retain information. And what we find is that amnesics, their spontaneous thoughts are much less detailed. It does actually affect the thoughts they have about the past and the thoughts they have about the future in terms of the frequency of those. So if we go on to a patient who I examined, HCM, had amnesia himself, and he had disruptions to the way he thought about the past and future as well. So he his view of the past was kind of focused on this childhood. He didn't have access to the recent past. He only had access to the distant past and childhood. And what's the result of that? The result of that, unfortunately for him, is that the future perceptions he had were very unrealistic. So he would, for example, imagine moving into a flat in York, which is on a 3rd-story flat, but actually not factoring in the fact he had very severe mobility problems, which would prevent that. So we here see a link between past and the future and where it's gone wrong. And if we go to the next slide, we examined another patient who had damage to the frontal lobe. So here it's highlighted in green on the picture of the brain. So this is called the prefrontal cortex, or sometimes just called the frontal lobe. And if you click on Helgi, so I examined this patient, MW, who was actually went up the ranks of the police, in the police, became a detective chief inspector. However, in 1990, he was found unconscious by his wife, and it was discovered that he had an aneurysm, so like a bleed on the brain, which affected his frontal lobes. So in the next slide, so what we saw is we assessed, we gave him them cues. So we gave him them kind of directed tasks that I mentioned before, where we would give specific cues, and we would say, okay, can you think of a recent memory? Can you think of a plausible future event related to this? And if you click on, we'll see a couple of examples. So, you know, he he told this kind of like, it was almost like a story of the past where he said he died twice. He said the professor that saved me in the hospital went mad. He turned up unshaven and in pajamas. He had this very confident memory, which obviously was false. It was verifiably false by speaking to his wife and other friends. And when we asked him, what do you think plausibly would happen in the future? He said he would buy Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Fuji. He would rent them out. If Anthony Hopkins can own Snowdon and Sean Connery can own Ben Nevis, I can own Kilimanjaro. He had very positive and optimistic views of the future, which are not representative of the kind of helpful future thoughts that we have generally.
I think that's a really good warning against the kind of popular self-help literature that will say, see where you want to be and you will get there, or whatever. Like, the secret to success is visualizing success. We know that it's not as simple as that, and that if your vision of success is completely out of whack with what's realistic, then it might be entertaining. I don't know. That's an interesting one. Do you think patient MW kind of enjoyed having these experiences?
100%, and I think it gives you a sense of maybe a bit of power, a bit of over the environment that he had. He was quite powerless. He was in a care home, so I think it gives you a sense of power, and it gave him a sense of to impress people with these stories that are going to happen. It's pretty interesting stuff.
So it's quite nice because there is obviously value in fantasy in and of itself, but I guess the point we've been trying to make is that future thinking has a kind of adaptive function that can actually influence our survival on an evolutionary level, and maybe our kind of social and economic success and whatever in the modern world is more about being realistic, and it's kind of a different thing from simply being able to imagine things that are totally like the moon on a stick type stuff. Cool. So, to summarize what we've been through in part 3, maybe you can take us through this as well, actually, Scott. I think most of this is your content.
Yeah. So we know that spontaneous thoughts, they're linked to our sense of self. They're linked to our goals. I think we're going to talk about this in a minute as well. So yeah. But we know also that in some kind of psychological ill health and also in neurological illness, this can become disconnected. This good connection between the self and autobiographical knowledge and the way that we think about the future becomes dislodged and disconnected. So, the argument is they're no longer helpful, and they might even be unhelpful for example, planning your week and things like that. Just to kind of confirm, things like OCD and other anxiety disorders have a successful proved remedy, CBT, and things like that, which actually reduce those intrusive thoughts. So there is a positive way out of that kind of loop that I mentioned. Yeah, so there's a delicate balance between spontaneous thought and also mental health, and this is actually a really big topic. Obviously, mental health issues is a big area at the moment, and we're learning a lot about the link between spontaneous thought and mental ill health. So to summarize what we've gone through so far, we've gone through a lot of stuff. So thank you for staying with us the whole time. This is the last bit of the talk. Yeah, so I guess the main kind of thing of this talk is that we have lots of these kind of thoughts that pop into our head, and they might seem kind of superficial at first glance, but actually there's a lot of depth to it, and they actually say a lot about motivation. So Helgi, if you want to push it forward. So we know, for example, that our thoughts are reliant on our knowledge base, on our cognitive skills, on the way that we see the future. And that also interacts with what we see in the environment. So whether we're seeing certain phrases on screen or certain pictures, that influences the way that we think about ourselves as well. So and it can kind of push us as well. We know that things in the environment can, as Helgi was saying, can kind of make us slightly influence our thoughts, but essentially that's all based on our own personal goals and the uncompleted goals that I mentioned previously. So this brings us round to this idea of are we automata? You know, are our thoughts really are they really important? I mean, the behaviorists, like the coffee cup example I showed you, you know, coffee makes you feel more warmly against other people. This was a really big idea, even up to the, you know, into the 1990s. There was a big idea that people thought that a lot of thoughts are just fluff. They're just kind of the fluff on top, and we don't really need to take them into consideration. But I think now there's definitely a bigger change in psychology, where we appreciate the importance of these different thoughts that pop into our head. We can analyze them and actually mean something that relate to the way that we go about our lives and we achieve our goals. So they actually serve a real genuine function. And yes, we're not just automata, I think is the message that we've got.
Nice positive note to end on. We didn't want to leave you all with the kind of doom and gloom, although often what we find, you know, lecturing and teaching in university and also giving public talks is that people are really interested in that, looking at dysfunctional states kind of stuff, and what, for example, amnesia has to tell us about the kind of healthy human psyche, and for those of us who are lucky to experience that. So if you would like to know more about any of these things, or indeed participate in research, as I said, we've got online-based studies running now. So anywhere in the world, you can potentially participate in something without having to kind of be in York and sit in that hot seat. We've also got some web addresses here on screen for our academic school within York St John University, which has some nice, I think people have been doing some short videos and things for that, haven't they, recently? For the blog. So now we've left ourselves with a nice little 10 minutes at the end, if anybody would like to hit us up with any more questions. I know there's one from my dad that Scott said, yes, we'll come back to that at the end and we'll discuss that. So maybe if we start on that, and then we've got another open question just here about amnesia.
Yeah, so I think if we start off with that first question then, so do you want to read that out, Helgi?
Yeah, so surely being asked to monitor your future thinking makes you more likely to do it.
Yeah. So I think the answer to that one is that yes, that's exactly what researchers found. So well spotted. Some researchers in Italy, I think it was, Helgi, that they conducted this study, and they found that if you ask people to monitor their thoughts about the past or the future, you tend to find more of them. It doesn't necessarily affect the quality of them, but it affects how many you get. So you're more likely to get more. And the reason we ask people for them is that we simply have something to analyze. It does come down to that. We've got more things to analyze from people. The way to unbias all that is just to put people in a room with some kind of stimuli, and then every now and then we stop them and we'll just ask, you know, what are you thinking of now? Can you describe it? So that's the most unbiased way, and yeah, we can do that as well. So there's a couple of ways we can go about it to unbias what we're doing, but we do sometimes have to just ask people, can you tell us throughout the week when you have future thoughts about spontaneous future thoughts? If we said, can you give us any thought throughout the week, we can do that. But unfortunately, we wouldn't get many or we would get a lot of different responses. So we'd have to find those future thoughts. One way that they've done it recently, and people might question the ethics of this, is to actually do a conversational monitoring. I can't remember what they called it, Helgi, can you?
Conversational time travel. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what they did is they put microphones on people, and they monitored what people were saying as they went through their day, and then they could actually quantify afterwards. And they, you know, so obviously monitoring out, you know, anonymizing certain things, but yeah, that's one.
I think the really interesting thing about that study, and I only remember it in quite a gist-like way, but the interesting thing was that something we've not really had time to touch on is that in that mind-wandering state in the lab, people tend to have more thoughts about the future than the past, all other things being equal. If you actually bring in more verbal cues, it sways them towards the past. And so maybe related to that, when you get almost eavesdrop on people, as Scott's just explained, by paging them and just recording what they're saying intermittently throughout the day, they tend to talk a lot more about the past than the future. So hopefully maybe that coheres with people's experience. I know most of you said that you'd shared both in the past week. And the reason why we asked you whether you'd shared it is to try and get that idea of, okay, these thoughts come to mind all the time, but maybe only occasionally they're important enough to maybe form part of the conversation. And it seems like people share details of the past more than the future. And so there's this theory that like episodic memory and being able to kind of reminisce and reflect on specific events from the past has a mainly social function, and relates to that kind of storytelling and the human race kind of having this affinity for narrative, whereas future thinking is maybe more sort of egocentric and having future thoughts which relate to your goals and allow you to prioritize and to pursue them maybe happens just as much, but it's less likely to become the topic of conversation. So the next question is about amnesia, Scott. So just wanted to check on the subject of amnesia. If you're unable to recall recent memories accurately, does that directly impact your ability to imagine a realistic future?
So that's a really good question. So thanks for that. I think the research that we've done suggests that yes. So if you have somebody, for example, with dementia, who we know that Alzheimer's disease mainly affects them recent memories, and then that people might still retain those more remote memories from their past. We would expect that to affect how they imagine their future. Because purely relating to the fact that their knowledge base is based on maybe 30 years ago. So if they're imagining what they're going to do next week, they might imagining meeting people who have moved away to another country, who may even have passed away, and they might imagine, those futures, and that's why they're unrealistic to the extent that they're relying on that knowledge of the past that's not there. Hope that answers your question.
Any more questions? We've got a few more minutes to field them at the end. We're coming into the station just at the right time here, Scott. There was a mad rush in the middle. I think it's always tempting with these things to prepare too much stuff. And actually, the level of interaction that we've got from you guys as an audience has been brilliant today. And so, yeah, we wanted it to be as interactive as possible and to kind of spark off people reflecting on their own kind of mental experience. And maybe you might be thinking, oh yeah, actually I have these little sort of spontaneous previews or almost like premonitions of something that might be about to happen all the time, and I thought I was weird, or that kind of thing. And so, hopefully now you've been exposed to the kind of scientific study of that.
We have one more question, I think.
Yes, lovely.
Okay, so someone's saying, I'm interested in those suffering from PTSD. Is mental time travel into the future possible for these people? Yeah, so to answer that question, PTSD is, I mean, part of the diagnostic criteria is these intrusive, unpleasant, unwanted thoughts, essentially. So that is part of the diagnosis. You can call it mental time travel if you want, and people have studied it with that definition of that kind of very specific events coming back to mind. But yeah, to be honest, it's always been part of that definition of PTSD. So they do suffer from that. Whether it's future oriented or not, there isn't as much research about it. I think there's one study done on Iraq and Afghanistan veterans from Denmark, and they have what's called pre-trauma. So they imagine going back to war, and that's an intrusive thought for them. So guess I've remembered that. So yes, they would have some kind of from the research, they could possibly have some traumatic view of the future that could drive their emotions and their behaviors and things. OCD, someone said, how common is OCD? It's about 1 to 3%, I think, of the population. Yeah.
I was just doing a couple of typed answers, but yeah, any last minuters, you can get in there before the whistle blows.
Was there anything else we've missed, Helgi, or is that?
I've typed a couple of answers, but you've answered the OCD prevalence question live, so that's great. and I will. Yeah, it's always nice to have some courteous attendees as well. I'm glad you enjoyed it. We have a few people have kind of trickled away in the last half hour or so, but we're kind of expecting that. So by all means, I'm still sharing that screen, I think, with our email addresses. Get in touch for more info, or if you're interested in participating in a study. I've got one running at the moment where you can win an M&S voucher, and it takes about 25 to 30 minutes, and I'm just looking for adults of all ages whose first language is English. But beyond that, it's pretty unrestricted. So yeah, do get in touch. We've had one more comment actually, which is about kind of dwelling on the past. So I'm almost 70, but try not to dwell on the past. I want to live in the present and the future. Why are we told to live in the present? So that's quite a big philosophical question to tackle right at the end. But have you got any last words on that, Scott?
A really good question. Yeah, I think what all we've talked about is about, the more mechanisms like general. I'd say they're all very, on average, people think like this. But of course, there's the massive element of preference, and some people don't want to think about the present, and some people want to focus on the future, and that's absolutely fine. And that's, I think, just how we all differ in terms of our personalities and the way we think about the future. And some people ruminate about the past, so that might not be good, but you can also think positively about the past. So I think there's lots of different ways, and it all depends on your outlook, your optimism. It could relate to optimism and your personalities.
You can probably hear me tapping away because I've got something else really, really interesting in here, and I'm asking the person if they want to provide an email address. I'm happy to provide more info, kind of asynchronously, because we've hit our end point now.
I think we've hit our end point, so we might lose everyone soon. So
yeah.
I'm a bit anxious about that, but that's my future anxiety. It just the screen goes black. But thank you all for attending today, and I hope you've enjoyed this and other events at the Festival of Ideas.
Thank you very much. Good night, guys.